I will defend him. The black maid who saved a billionaire after his lawyer abandoned him in court. The courtroom was packed that morning. Reporters filled the benches, their cameras flashing each time the heavy wooden doors opened. Everyone had come to see the downfall of one of the richest men in the country, a man who once lived at the very top of society but was now fighting for his freedom. His name was Mr. Charles Bennett, a billionaire known for his luxury lifestyle, big investments, and powerful connections. People used to whisper his name with respect, but now they whispered it with curiosity, waiting for his ruin. Charles sat at the defendant's table in a sharp, dark suit. His face looked pale and tired, the shine of confidence gone. He kept glancing at his lawyer, a man in a gray suit who had promised to fight for him. This lawyer was expensive, famous, and the kind of man who usually never lost. Charles had trusted him completely. But there was tension in the air. The prosecutor's team looked ready to tear Charles apart, and the crowd seemed hungry for drama. Everyone wanted to see how the mighty would fall. Among the crowd, sitting quietly in the last row, was a woman nobody paid much attention to. She wore a plain dress, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and her eyes followed everything with care. Her name was Rosa. For years she had worked as a maid in Charles's mansion. She cleaned his floors, polished his silver, and served him tea. She was invisible in his world of riches, yet she had seen more than most people. She had heard whispers, seen the mood of the house, and noticed things nobody else bothered to notice. When the judge entered the courtroom, the room fell silent. The trial began, and the prosecution presented their side. They painted Charles as a greedy man who had crossed the line. They used strong words, dramatic pauses, and waved documents in the air to prove their point. The audience leaned forward, fascinated. Charles's lawyer listened quietly, but instead of taking notes, his eyes looked distant. Something was wrong. Charles noticed and leaned closer to whisper, "You're going to counter this, right?" The lawyer gave no answer. Minutes passed, and when it was finally time for the defense to respond, the lawyer stood up slowly. His voice was shaky, nothing like the confident man Charles had hired. Then, without warning, he turned to the judge and said, "Your Honor, I cannot continue with this case. I am stepping down as Mr. Bennett's lawyer." The courtroom gasped. People whispered, shocked. Even the judge's eyebrows lifted in surprise. Charles froze. He thought he had misheard. "What are you saying?" he whispered sharply. But the lawyer only gathered his papers, avoiding Charles's eyes. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. And then he walked away, leaving his client alone in front of the world. The judge struck his gavel. "Order in the court. Order." The prosecutor smirked, knowing that without a lawyer, Charles's chances were nearly destroyed. Reporters scribbled furiously, already writing headlines like, "Billionaire abandoned by own lawyer." Charles sat there in shock, his heart pounding. Never in his life had he felt so helpless. Money, power, and influence meant nothing in that moment. He was just a man cornered, and the walls were closing in. The judge turned toward him. "Mr. Bennett, do you have another lawyer ready to represent you?" Charles opened his mouth but no words came out. His entire world was falling apart, and he had no one. That was when a voice came from the back of the room. It was soft at first, but steady. "I will defend him." The words cut through the noise, and everyone turned to see who had spoken. Rosa, the maid, was standing. She clutched her simple bag tightly and looked straight at the judge. Her voice was not loud, but it carried strength. "I will defend him," she repeated, more firmly this time. For a moment, there was silence. Then laughter filled the room. Reporters chuckled, the audience shook their heads in disbelief, and even some of the lawyers grinned. A maid. A woman with no law degree? It sounded absurd. Charles turned, his eyes widening when he saw her. Rosa, he whispered, confused. He could not believe what she had just said. The judge raised an eyebrow. And who are you, madam? I work in Mr. Bennet's house, Rosa said calmly. I am his maid. But I cannot sit here and watch him be left alone without anyone to speak for him. The courtroom erupted again, but Rosa did not flinch. She stood tall, her hands trembling slightly but her eyes burning with determination. The judge tapped his gavel again. Silence. He looked at Rosa for a long moment, perhaps expecting her to back down. But she didn't. Charles buried his face in his hands. He felt embarrassment, fear, and confusion all at once. How could his maid, a woman who dusted his bookshelves and ironed his shirts, possibly stand in a courtroom filled with trained lawyers? And yet, deep inside, a small part of him felt a spark of something else, hope. Because when everyone else had abandoned him, Rosa had stood up. She had spoken the words no one else dared to say. I will defend him. The judge sighed, clearly unsure of what to do. The law was strict, but so was the human heart. And in that moment, Rosa's courage had caught everyone's attention. The scene ended with tension hanging in the air. Nobody knew what would happen next. Would the judge laugh her out of the room, or would he give her a chance? All eyes were on Rosa, the maid who had just changed the course of the trial with one brave sentence. And Charles, for the first time in his life, realized that the person who might save him was not a millionaire, not a lawyer, and not a friend in high places. It was his maid. The courtroom was buzzing with disbelief. Rosa, the maid, had just stood up and offered to defend the billionaire. It sounded impossible, even foolish, yet the seriousness in her voice had silenced the laughter for a brief moment. People leaned forward, curious to see what would happen next. The judge studied her carefully. He was a man used to unusual situations, but this was something new even for him. Madam, he said firmly, this is a court of law, not a place for jokes. Are you aware of what you are asking? Rosa's hands trembled slightly, but she lifted her chin. Yes, Your Honor. I know I am not a lawyer. But I also know that this man has been left alone. He deserves someone to speak for him, even if that someone is me. The prosecutor laughed, shaking his head. This is ridiculous. A maid representing a billionaire in court? Is this a comedy show? His voice dripped with mockery, and the reporters scribbled eagerly, already imagining the headlines. But Rosa did not look at the prosecutor. Her eyes remained steady on the judge. I am not here for jokes. I am here because I cannot stay quiet while I watch him be crushed without a voice. The room grew tense. The judge tapped his gavel. Order. Order in the court. He leaned back in his chair, thinking. It was against normal rules to let someone without legal training argue in court. But at the same time, the law also allowed a person to choose their representative, as long as the court approved it. This was rare, almost unheard of, but the judge could see the determination in Rosa's eyes. Finally, he spoke. Very well. Since Mr. Bennet has no other counsel present, I will allow this woman to speak on his behalf temporarily. But let it be clear, if she causes disorder, I will end this immediately. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Nobody could believe what they had just heard. The maid had been given a chance. Charles turned to look at Rosa, his expression a mix of shock, fear, and confusion. He leaned forward and whispered, "What are you doing? This is madness. You'll embarrass yourself and me." Rosa bent closer and whispered back, "You have no one else. Do you want to sit here and let them destroy you without even trying?" Charles swallowed hard. He had no answer. He looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly small. The judge cleared his throat. Proceed. The prosecutor rose quickly, ready to strike. Your Honor, with all due respect, This woman has no legal knowledge. This is a waste of time. Rosa's voice cut through. Then let me waste your time. If I have nothing to offer, I will fail. But if I do have something, you will not silence me before I even try. The judge's lips tightened, but he gestured for the prosecutor to sit down. The court will decide whether she has anything to offer. Continue. Rosa walked slowly to the defense table. She had never stood in such a place before, never imagined she would face so many powerful eyes. Her heart pounded, but her steps were steady. She placed her bag on the table and stood beside Charles. Everyone in the courtroom stared. Some pitied her, others mocked her silently, but a few felt a strange sense of respect. It took courage to stand there, especially when the whole world was against her. The prosecutor began questioning the first witness again, trying to prove that Charles had signed documents that showed corruption. He spoke quickly, confidently, throwing around legal terms that Rosa barely understood. But she listened carefully. She remembered long nights in the mansion, hearing conversations between staff, noticing the way papers were left on desks, and realizing which stories were true and which were not. When it was her turn to cross-examine, the courtroom held its breath. Would she even know what to say? Rosa stepped forward slowly. "Sir," she said to the witness, her voice respectful but clear, "you say you saw Mr. Bennett sign these papers with your own eyes, correct?" The witness nodded. "Yes." Rosa tilted her head. "Can you tell the court the exact date?" The witness hesitated. I don't remember the exact day, but it was last spring." Rosa's eyes sharpened. "Last spring? Do you mean before or after Mr. Bennett's trip overseas?" "Because I was in the house, and I remember he was not even in the country during those weeks." "Are you sure about your memory?" The witness blinked. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. The jury leaned forward. Rosa continued softly, "Sometimes we think we remember, but memory can play tricks, especially when money or pressure is involved. So I ask again, are you certain?" The witness stammered, I might be mixing the dates." The crowd murmured in surprise. Rosa had done what no one expected. She had made the first crack in the prosecution's case. Charles stared at her in disbelief. His maid, the woman who polished his floors, had just stood in front of a witness and shaken his testimony. The prosecutor quickly tried to interrupt. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. She is confusing the witness." But the judge raised his hand. "The witness has admitted uncertainty. That is relevant." Rosa stepped back, her heart racing. She had done it. She had spoken, and her words had mattered. Charles leaned closer, whispering, "How did you know that?" Rosa gave a small smile. "Because I was there. I was always there. You just never noticed." Her words stung him, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. He had never noticed. He had lived in a world above her, yet now she was the only one willing to stand beside him. The trial continued, and Rosa kept watching, listening, and asking simple questions that revealed cracks. She did not know the language of lawyers, but she knew truth when she saw it. She knew lies when she heard them. And slowly, piece by piece, she started to win the attention of the jury. Reporters scribbled with wide eyes. The story was bigger than they had expected. It was no longer just the fall of a billionaire, it was the rise of a maid who dared to speak. By the end of the day, Rosa was exhausted, but she had stood her ground. She had not let Charles face the fire alone. As the judge announced that the trial would continue the next day, Rosa gathered her things quietly. People whispered as she walked past them. Some laughed, others sneered, but a few nodded in silent respect. Charles walked beside her, his voice low. "Rosa. I don't know why you are doing this, but, thank you." She looked at him, her expression calm but firm. "I am doing it because it is right." You may be rich, but right now you are just a man who needs someone to stand beside him. If no one else will, I will. Those words struck him harder than anything the prosecutors had said. For the first time, Charles felt something new in his chest, not pride, not fear, but gratitude. And as they stepped out of the courtroom into the flashing lights of cameras, the world began to realize that this trial was no longer ordinary. Something extraordinary had begun. The maid had spoken, and nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, the courthouse was more crowded than ever before. News of the maid who had stood up to defend a billionaire had spread like wildfire. People who normally ignored court trials were suddenly interested. Some came to mock, others came out of curiosity, but many came because they could not believe a simple maid had dared to take on professional lawyers. Cameras flashed the moment Rosa stepped out of a taxi and walked up the courthouse steps. She wore the same simple dress as before, her hair tied neatly back, and she carried her small handbag pressed to her side. She did not look like a lawyer. She did not even look like someone used to being in the spotlight. But there was something in her eyes, calm, steady determination that made even the reporters pause. Charles followed behind her, his head lowered. He wore a fresh suit, but he looked nothing like the powerful man he had once been. For the first time in his life, he was not leading the way. He was following. Inside the courtroom, whispers filled the air as people pointed toward Rosa. "That's her," they murmured. "That's the maid who stood up yesterday." Some laughed, shaking their heads, but others watched with genuine curiosity. When the trial resumed, the prosecutor stood with a confident smile. He clearly thought Rosa's presence would make his job easier. "Your Honor," he began, "let us not forget that this is a serious matter. The defense is being represented by someone with no legal knowledge. This case should be treated accordingly." The judge frowned. "You've made that point yesterday, counselor. The court has decided to allow her to proceed. Now let's continue." The prosecutor sighed dramatically and called his next witness. A business associate of Charles came forward, ready to testify against him. The man sat down, adjusting his tie nervously. The prosecutor began. "Is it true that Mr. Bennett pressured you into signing certain contracts that were dishonest?" The witness nodded quickly. "Yes, that is true." The prosecutor smiled. "And did you feel threatened by him?" "Yes, I did." The prosecutor spread his arms proudly, as though the case was already won. No more questions. Everyone turned to Rosa. She rose slowly and walked toward the witness. Her steps were not rushed, her voice not raised, but the room quieted as soon as she began. "Sir," she said gently, "you said you felt threatened. Can you explain what you mean by that? Did Mr. Bennett ever use violence or harsh words toward you?" The man hesitated. "No, not exactly. But his presence was intimidating." Rosa tilted her head slightly. "His presence, or your fear of losing your own power?" The man frowned. I don't understand." Rosa continued, her voice steady. "I have worked in Mr. Bennett's house for many years. He is not a perfect man, but I have never seen him raise his hand to anyone. I have never seen him shout without reason. You say you were threatened, but perhaps it was not him who threatened you. Perhaps it was your own fear of losing what you had." The witness shifted uncomfortably. The jury leaned forward, curious. Rosa pressed on. "Tell me, sir, who benefits if Mr. Bennett falls? Who gains from his downfall?" The witness froze. The prosecutor jumped up. "Objection. Irrelevant." But the judge raised his hand. "Overruled. The witness may answer." The man stammered, I don't know." Rosa's eyes locked on his. "You don't know, or you don't want to say. Sometimes silence speaks louder than lies." The witness looked down, unable to meet her eyes. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Rosa had done it again. She had taken a polished witness and left him shaky and uncertain. Charles stared at her in awe. Each word she spoke felt like a sharp blade cutting through the web of lies surrounding him. She was not quoting laws or using complex arguments. She was using truth, honesty, and simple logic that anyone could understand. The prosecutor gritted his teeth. He called another witness, this time a financial officer who claimed Charles had ordered illegal transfers. The man came forward with confidence, presenting numbers and documents. "Here," he said, holding up papers, "is proof that Mr. Bennett moved funds secretly." The prosecutor smiled triumphantly. "Clear evidence, Your Honor." Rosa stood. Her voice was calm, but there was fire beneath it. "May I see the document?" The judge allowed it. Rosa took the paper in her hands, her eyes scanning it carefully. She was no accountant, but she had often cleaned Charles's office. She knew his handwriting, the way he signed his name, the way his papers were marked. She held up the document. "This is not his signature." Gasps filled the room. The prosecutor rolled his eyes. "Objection. She is not an expert in handwriting." But Rosa did not back down. She looked at the jury. "I may not be an expert, but I have polished the desk where he signed papers for years. I have collected the pens he left behind. I know the curve of his writing better than anyone in this room. This is not his hand. Look closely. Even you can see the difference." The jury members leaned forward, whispering among themselves. Some nodded, comparing the signature to others shown earlier. The prosecutor's smile faded. His witness looked nervous. The judge stroked his chin thoughtfully. "She raises a point. The signatures will need further examination." Once again, Rosa had turned the tide. Charles leaned closer, whispering with disbelief, "How are you doing this?" Rosa's voice was quiet, but firm. "Because I pay attention. That is what people like me do. While others look at power and money, we notice the small things. And sometimes, the small things are what save a life." The words hit Charles deeply. For years, he had ignored those small things. He had ignored people like Rosa, who worked in silence, observing, remembering. And now, those very things were his shield. The day went on like this. The prosecution presented their arguments with confidence, but Rosa countered each with questions that exposed cracks. She did not argue like a lawyer, she argued like a human being who refused to be fooled. Her honesty was disarming, her courage undeniable. By the end of the session, the jury was no longer laughing at her. The reporters were no longer mocking. Instead, they were fascinated. As the judge dismissed the court for the day, Rosa gathered her things quietly. Charles walked beside her, still in shock. "You were incredible," he admitted. Rosa looked at him calmly. "This is not about being incredible. This is about standing up when no one else will." Outside, the cameras flashed again, reporters shouting questions. "Rosa, how does it feel to defend a billionaire? Do you think you can really win?" She paused for a moment, then answered softly, "I am not here to win or lose. I am here to speak the truth. And the truth deserves a chance, no matter who tells it." Those words echoed far beyond the courthouse walls. They were printed in newspapers, repeated on television, and whispered in homes. That night, Charles sat alone in his mansion, thinking. He looked around at the grand halls, the expensive paintings, the glittering lights. He had built a life of wealth, but when the world turned against him, it was not his fortune that had saved him. It was Rosa, his maid, the woman he had hardly noticed all these years. For the first time in his life, Charles understood what loyalty truly meant. And as the trial continued, the world waited breathlessly, wondering if the maid's courage would be enough to stand against the storm still ahead. By the third week of the trial, The case had become the biggest story in the country. Every newspaper carried Rosa's picture, every news channel debated her courage, and every conversation on the street seemed to include her name. Some people admired her bravery, others dismissed her as foolish, but nobody could ignore her anymore. The courthouse, once just a place for legal arguments, now felt like a stage where the world was watching. The benches were packed every morning, and reporters camped outside from dawn till night. Everyone wanted to see if the maid would continue standing firm, or if she would finally break under the pressure. Inside, Rosa walked to the defense table with the same calm steps each day. She still wore her plain dresses, carried her small handbag, and never once tried to look like something she was not. She didn't need fancy clothes or titles. Her strength came from within, and it showed in every word she spoke. Charles walked beside her, but he looked different now. The man who once sat pale and broken had begun to carry himself with more dignity again. Not because of pride, but because Rosa's courage reminded him that he was not completely alone. The prosecution, however, had grown frustrated. Their sharp strategies and polished words were being weakened by Rosa's simple questions and fearless honesty. So they began to change their tactics. They tried to intimidate her. One morning, as the trial began, the prosecutor stood up with a sly smile. "Your Honor, before we continue, I must raise an important point. This woman is not a lawyer. She has no training, no license, no education in the law. Allowing her to continue is disrespectful to this court." The judge's eyes narrowed. "We've already addressed this matter. She has been permitted to proceed as the chosen representative of the defendant." But the prosecutor pressed on. "This is a mockery. What's next? Should we allow children to argue cases? Should we let janitors and cooks play at being lawyers? This is insulting." The crowd murmured. Some nodded, agreeing with him, while others frowned at his arrogance. Rosa stood slowly. Her voice was calm but strong. "You call it a mockery, sir. But what is more insulting? A maid standing to defend her employer with honesty, or a trained lawyer abandoning him when things became difficult?" The words hit hard. The room fell silent. Even the judge seemed to pause before continuing. The prosecutor's face reddened with anger. "This woman is wasting our time." But Rosa shook her head. "No, I am reminding you that truth is not only spoken by those with degrees. Truth can come from anyone who sees it clearly." The jury looked at her with new respect. The prosecutor clenched his fists, realizing he had underestimated her again. As the days passed, Rosa faced tougher witnesses. Some were powerful men who sneered at her, others were clever with words, but Rosa listened carefully to each one. She didn't try to sound smarter than them, she simply asked questions that made them trip over their own lies. One witness, a banker, tried to prove Charles had hidden money illegally. He spoke quickly, throwing around financial terms meant to confuse. Rosa raised her hand gently. "Excuse me, sir. Could you explain that in simple words? Because I believe the jury deserves to understand, not just hear big words." The banker frowned. "It's complicated. Ordinary people wouldn't understand." Rosa smiled softly. "I am an ordinary person. And if I don't understand, then how can we trust what you are saying? Please, explain it so that even someone like me can see if it is true." The banker stuttered, unable to simplify his lies. The jury exchanged glances, realizing he was hiding behind complicated language. Rosa had exposed him without even raising her voice. But the more Rosa succeeded, the more dangerous the atmosphere became. Outside the courthouse, people began to argue fiercely. Some praised her as a hero, a symbol of courage. Others mocked her, saying she was embarrassing the legal system. Rosa ignored both sides. She did not care about fame or ridicule. She cared only about doing what was right. Inside, The prosecution became desperate. They began to attack Charles more personally, painting him as a man of greed and pride. They waved pictures of his mansion, his cars, his expensive parties, trying to make the jury hate him. At one point, the prosecutor shouted, "This is the man you're defending. A man who lived in riches while people like you, Rosa, worked in his kitchen. Do you really believe he deserves saving?" The courtroom went still. All eyes turned to Rosa. The question was cruel, and it struck at her very heart. Rosa took a deep breath. Her voice was soft, but it carried across the silent room. "You are right. He lived in wealth, and I cleaned his floors. He dined at golden tables, and I washed his plates. He wore silk, and I wore cotton. But justice does not belong only to the rich or only to the poor. Justice belongs to everyone. If we let hatred decide, then this courtroom is no better than a marketplace. I am here because truth should not depend on money. Truth is truth, no matter who stands for it." Her words shook the room. Some people had tears in their eyes. Even Charles felt his throat tighten. For the first time in his life, someone had spoken to defend him not because of his wealth, but because of principle. The prosecutor fell silent, unable to argue. That day, as court adjourned, reporters rushed toward Rosa. "Why are you doing this? He is a billionaire, not a man from your world. Why fight for him?" Rosa answered simply, "Because when someone is abandoned, you do not ask how rich they are. You ask if they are still a human being." Her words spread like fire across the country. People began to see her not just as a maid, but as a symbol of loyalty, courage, and fairness. But the pressure was growing heavier. Some powerful people wanted her silenced. Rumors began to spread. People whispered that she was being threatened, that offers of money were being made to make her step back. But Rosa never wavered. Each morning, she arrived in her plain dress, carrying her small bag, and walked into the courtroom with steady steps. Charles noticed the weight she carried. One evening, he found the courage to speak as they left the courthouse. "Rosa, I don't know how to thank you. You've done more for me than anyone ever has. But I also worry. This fight is dangerous for you." Rosa looked at him with calm eyes. "Do not worry about me. Worry about the truth. If the truth survives, then I will be fine." Charles lowered his gaze, ashamed. For years, he had measured people by their wealth. He had thought loyalty could be bought, respect could be demanded, and power could solve everything. Now, a woman with no wealth, no power, and no education was teaching him the greatest lesson of his life. As the trial neared its final stage, the world held its breath. Would Rosa's courage be enough to stand against the strongest lawyers, the wealthiest prosecutors, and the weight of public opinion? Nobody knew. But one thing was certain: Rosa had already changed the story. What began as the trial of a billionaire had become something bigger, the story of a maid who refused to be silent, who stood in the face of ridicule, and who showed the world that courage can come from the most unexpected places. And as she walked out of the courthouse that evening, with reporters shouting her name and cameras flashing, Rosa whispered to herself, "Tomorrow, I will speak again. Tomorrow, I will defend him once more." The final day of the trial arrived like the climax of a long storm. The air outside the courthouse felt heavy, and the crowd was larger than ever. Reporters, citizens, and even foreign journalists filled the steps, waiting for the outcome of the case that had captured the nation. Everyone wanted to know, would the billionaire fall, or would the maid's courage save him? Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The jury looked tired but alert, the prosecutor looked sharp and determined, and Rosa sat beside Charles with her small handbag resting on her lap. She had no legal books, no documents, no expensive suits. Yet, over the past weeks, she had done what no one thought possible. She had shaken the prosecution's case and forced people to see the trial with fresh eyes. Charles sat straighter than he had in the beginning. He no longer looked like a broken man. Instead, there was a quiet strength in his face. He owed that strength to Rosa. He had entered the trial believing money could solve everything, but he had stayed standing because of loyalty, the kind that could not be bought. The judge entered, and silence fell over the courtroom. The trial resumed with closing arguments. The prosecutor was the first to speak. He rose, his voice booming with confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, let us not forget who we are dealing with. This man, Charles Bennett, is a billionaire who thought himself above the law. Do not be distracted by emotional tricks. Look at the facts, the documents, the accusations, the witnesses. A maid's sympathy does not erase a lifetime of greed." He paced the floor, his words sharp. "If you let him go free, what message do we send? That money and influence can wash away guilt. That anyone can stand in court and claim innocence without proof." He pointed at Charles. "Do not let him escape justice." The prosecutor sat down, satisfied with his performance. The jury looked thoughtful, some nodding, others frowning. Then it was Rosa's turn. She stood slowly, smoothing her plain dress. The room quieted. Some people leaned forward eagerly, others rolled their eyes, expecting her to fail. But Rosa did not look at them. She looked only at the jury. Her voice was steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, I know I am not a lawyer. I know I do not have the fancy words or the training that others here have. I am just a maid. I clean floors, I serve tea, I fold laundry. I never thought I would stand in a courtroom. But life brings us where we never expect to be." She paused, letting her words settle. "I have worked for Mr. Bennett for many years. I have seen him on his best days and on his worst. He is not a perfect man. None of us are. But I know this: he is not the man the prosecution has described. I know because I have lived under his roof, walked the halls of his home, and seen the truth with my own eyes." She lifted her chin. "The witnesses have contradicted themselves. The papers have shown errors. The signatures were forged. The stories do not match. And yet, they expect you to believe them because they wear suits and speak big words. But truth is not measured by clothes or titles. Truth is simple. And the simple truth is this: he is being framed." The courtroom murmured, but Rosa continued. Her voice grew stronger with every word. "They call me foolish for standing here. Maybe I am. But I would rather be a fool who speaks for the abandoned than be silent and watch injustice win. They laugh because I am a maid. But let me ask you, does being a maid make me blind to lies? Does cleaning floors make me unable to see truth? No. Sometimes those who are overlooked see more than anyone else." The jury's eyes softened. Some nodded slowly. Rosa's voice trembled slightly, but she pressed on. "When his lawyer left, everyone thought it was over. Even he thought it was over. But I could not sit in that seat and watch him stand alone. I had no law degree, but I had a voice. And I used it. Not because he is rich, not because he is my employer, but because every person deserves someone to stand beside them. Even when the world walks away." She turned toward Charles for a brief moment. His eyes glistened. Then she faced the jury again. "This case is not just about Charles Bennett. It is about what kind of justice system we want. Is justice only for the powerful lawyers and the clever talkers? Or is justice for everyone, for the rich and the poor, the strong and the weak, the master and the servant? If you believe truth matters more than appearances, then I ask you, with all humility, to give him the chance he deserves. Look past the noise, past the wealth, past the ridicule, and see the truth." Her final words were simple. "Do not convict an innocent man. Do not let lies win. Choose justice." She sat down, her hands trembling slightly. The courtroom was silent. Not even the reporters moved. It was as if the world itself had stopped to breathe. The judge gave final instructions, and then the jury left to deliberate. Hours passed. Outside, crowds grew restless. Reporters speculated wildly, predicting outcomes. Inside, Rosa sat quietly, her hands folded, her eyes closed in silent prayer. Charles sat beside her, unable to speak. He had never felt so small, yet never so human. Finally, the jury returned. The foreman stood, holding the paper that would decide everything. The judge asked, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor." The room held its breath. In the case of Charles Bennett, we find the defendant, not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, shouts, and cheers filled the air. Reporters rushed out to spread the news. Charles sat frozen, hardly believing what he had heard. Then he turned to Rosa. She looked at him with calm eyes, and for the first time, he broke down. He bowed his head, tears falling silently. "Thank you, Rosa. You saved me." Rosa placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I only spoke what I saw. You must decide what you will do with the life you've been given back." Outside, cameras flashed wildly. The world shouted Rosa's name. Some called her a hero, others a miracle. But Rosa did not smile. She was tired, not from defeat but from the weight of standing against the impossible. Charles walked beside her as they left the courthouse. Reporters shoved microphones in his face, asking if he felt victorious. But he shook his head. "This is not my victory. This is hers." He pointed to Rosa. The crowd cheered, chanting her name. For the first time, Rosa, the maid who had always lived unseen, was seen by everyone. But she did not bask in it. She only whispered, "Justice was served. That is enough." That night, Charles returned to his mansion. He walked through the grand halls, past the glittering chandeliers and the polished floors. Everything looked the same, yet everything felt different. Because now he saw what he had never seen before: the quiet strength of those who had always been by his side. He called Rosa into his study. "You have changed my life," he told her. "I lived in pride, blind to the people who truly mattered. But you opened my eyes. From now on, I will never see you as just a maid. You are my savior, my defender, and my friend." Rosa lowered her gaze humbly. "I only did what I felt was right. That is enough for me." But Charles shook his head. "It will never be enough for me. I will spend the rest of my life proving worthy of what you did for me." And so, the story ended not with the fall of a billionaire, but with the rise of a maid whose words "I will defend him" had changed everything. Her courage had not only saved a man, but also reminded the world that justice is not about wealth, power, or titles. It is about truth. And truth, when spoken with courage, can come from anyone, even a maid who refused to stay silent.